The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, the entrenchment of American wealth and political power, a faithful movement to end mass incarceration, plus Bill Press with Igor Volsky, founder and the director of Guns Down America. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. In a new book, Paul Starr argues that much of our politics today is a struggle over the historic entrenchment of great wealth through political power. And if Donald Trump gets reelected, this entrenchment will only deepen. And we say hello to Paul Starr, author of Entrenchment, Wealth, Power, and the Constitution of Democratic Societies. He's also a professor of sociology and public affairs at Princeton University, co-founder and founding co-editor of the American Prospect magazine, and winner of the Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction and the Bancroft Prize in American History. Paul Starr, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
I'm delighted to be with you.
And our pleasure to have you with us. And congratulations on your new book. To start out, how do you define entrenchment?
Okay, so to entrench something is to cement it, to make it hard to change. And if you think about a constitution is an example of entrenchment. We write rules into a constitution to make them hard to change. It's very hard to amend the U.S. Constitution, for example. But then there are other kinds of entrenchment that are really quite different. The entrenchment of power and privilege, entrenchment of arrangements where there really wasn't any conscious and certainly not democratic intention, but things become entrenched nonetheless. And so I use the word entrenchment in a neutral way. It can be good, it can be bad, but if there's an undertone of worry about it, well, that's right. There should be.
Why was this such an important book to write for our current day?
Yeah, so I started this book long before Donald Trump got elected. But I think the word entrenchment, people might think of as what they really have to be worried about, thinking about the future. It's one thing if Donald Trump proves to be an aberration, but it'll be quite a different thing if he gets reelected and if, as a result, Trumpism gets entrenched. If, for example, the kind of way he governs becomes the pattern in the future. If, for example, he gets another 2 Supreme Court appointments, so instead of a 5-4 court, we have a 7-2 conservative court. That will be much more radical than the one we have today, and it will last for a long time. That, to me, that's an example of what could become conservative entrenchment.
I shudder to think of all of that. The book is a deep read into the history of ideas and politics in our nation, and you include an interesting example that many of us may not think about, inherited wealth. Why is that important to understand?
Well, it's important to understand because inherited wealth has been a basis of power throughout history. And indeed, if you think back to the American Revolution, to the period in the late 18th century when the greatest form of wealth was landed wealth, and unfortunately in the United States also the ownership of people, the ownership of slaves, that was at the center of the struggles, first of the American Revolution and later in the Civil War. And so wealth can be a basis of power. It almost always is. It can be a basis of domination. And when one of the issues at the time of the American Revolution, again, this is not something that people may think about, had to do with inheritance laws. And in England, there had been for centuries a rule called primogeniture, that all the wealth of a landed aristocratic family went to the eldest son. And indeed, that was the rule in some of the American colonies. And one of the achievements of the Revolution was to eliminate this system of inheritance. Jefferson counted it as among one of his major achievements when he was served as governor of Virginia in 1776, to eliminate that system of inheritance because it concentrated wealth among the very, very few. And so changing the rules of inheritance, obviously abolishing slavery, later limiting monopolies, these have been ways to limit the power of concentrated wealth. And that's really at the center of this book.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned slavery as an entrenched idea. As a nation still trying to deal with being a multicultural society, what can we learn from understanding the entrenchment and the evolution out of slavery?
Well, slavery is an example of an institution that lasted for centuries. And really, in early American history, it seemed impossible to dislodge. The investment in slaves in the South was greater in 1860 than the total investment in industry and finance at that time. So eliminating slavery involved expropriating the wealth of some of the most powerful groups in the United States, these Southern slaveholders. But nonetheless, we did it. And it is really a source, I think it should be a source of encouragement. It's of course, tragic, of course. It took the Civil War to make that happen. But it's one of many examples in the book about overcoming entrenched power.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Paul Starr, author of Entrenchment, Wealth, Power, and the Constitution of Democratic Societies. Of course, also co-founder and founding co-editor of the American Prospect magazine. And Paul, we seem to be at a remarkable moment in our political conversations with the phrase democratic socialism being discussed in mainstream conversations. Does this suggest that the entrenchment of wealth and power in our country could actually be disrupted?
Okay, so I'm not keen on introducing the phrase democratic socialism into American politics when what Bernie Sanders and others generally mean is the liberalism of the New Deal, and because the examples that he cites are indeed FDR's examples, Social Security and laws supporting unions and so forth. So we have a tradition in the United States, a liberal tradition, that I think ought to be the basis of how Democrats talk about these kinds of issues, rather than going to the concept of socialism. And on this point, I very much agree with Elizabeth Warren, who says, frankly, she's a capitalist. She believes in markets, but she believes in fair rules. And what she is arguing against is the kind of rigged rules that have favored the rich, that have favored powerful corporations. That, to me, that's the kind of language I think that makes sense. So, yeah, I think these issues about wealth and power are really front and center. They're crucial for people to be thinking about. But I think there's a language that we can use that fits much more within American traditions, and I think is just much more promising as a political strategy.
Mm-hmm. You also recently wrote in the American Prospect about growing anxiety that conservative power is getting increasingly entrenched. Do you share that anxiety?
Yes, I do. I think so. What I wrote about in that article is that there are really two kinds of anxieties, I think, that are driving American politics right now. There's the anxiety on the right about demographic and cultural changes, creating new majorities, new popular majorities. And that anxiety on the right is, I think, leading Trump and the Republicans to adopt anti-democratic measures, voter suppression, gerrymandering, and so forth, and to try to entrench themselves through court appointments, through control of the Supreme Court. And then on the left, there's, I think, a very reasonable anxiety. It is an anxiety I share, that conservative power may become so entrenched that popular majorities cannot unseat it. And that partly involves the Supreme Court. It involves the structure of the U.S. Senate, which overrepresents the more rural, whiter Republican states, and which has given the Republican Party something of an advantage. So my concern is about this power of concentrated wealth. It's about the use of the power of incumbency by Republicans through means like voter suppression, and it's about the effects now of the advantages that Republicans are deriving from the fact that Democratic voters are very concentrated in urban areas and cities and in the most urbanized states, and that is giving the Republicans an advantage in the Senate. It's actually also giving them an advantage in many state legislatures. And so Democrats have to think long term about how they're going to get out from under these bases of entrenched power that are serving Republicans.
And that leads me into my next question. What would you suggest Democrats do to fight back against this kind of entrenchment?
Well, I think the most important thing to do in the short run is to defeat Donald Trump, is through voter mobilization to fight voter suppression. But I do think there's a long-term agenda that Democrats need to consider if they have the opportunity, and I hope when they have the opportunity. And one of the things that I talk about in that article in The Prospect is the idea of admitting the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico as states, something which I think can be justified on the inherent merits and which would help rectify the balance in the U.S. Senate. Because at this point, both African Americans and Latinos are grossly underrepresented in the Senate because of that overrepresentation of the more rural white states. And admitting Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia, which, as I say, is justified on the inherent merits. These are large populations of American citizens who are denied rights of political representation. But that will also help correct this imbalance in the structure of the Senate and actually also in the Electoral College.
Okay. Paul Starr, author of Entrenchment, Wealth, Power, and the Constitution of Democratic Societies. Of course, professor of sociology and public affairs at Princeton University, co-founder and founding co-editor of the American Prospect magazine, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Paul, we appreciate your time. Thank you very much, and we do look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Great. Thank you.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America. Whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, dismantling the systemic injustice of mass incarceration. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Corporate bosses don't talk about it in public, but among themselves, they whisper excitedly about implementing a transformative AI agenda across our economy. AI stands for Artificial Intelligence, the rapidly advancing digital technology of creating thinking robots that program themselves, act on their own, and even reproduce themselves. These automatons are coming soon to a workplace near you. Not wanting to stir a preemptive rebellion by human workers, corporate chieftains avoid terms like automation of jobs, instead substituting euphemisms like digital transformation of work. Privately, however, top executives see AI as their path to windfall profits and personal enrichment by replacing whole swaths of their workforce with an automated army of cheap machines that don't demand raises, take time off, or form unions. As one prominent tech exec confided to the New York Times, AI will eliminate 40% of the world's jobs within 15 years. Some CEOs are so giddy about AI's profiteering potential that they openly admit their intentions. Take Foxconn, the Taiwanese electronics giant hailed as a job-creating savior last year by Donald Trump. It was given $3 billion in public subsidies to open a huge manufacturing plant in Wisconsin. But it's now reneging and declaring that it intends to replace 80% of its global workforce with robots within 10 years. Corporate apologists say displaced humans can be, quote, reskilled to do something else. But what? Where? When? No response. This is Jim Hightower saying executives say that the machine takeover is the march of technological progress. Hogwash. It's a choice being made by an elite group of corporate and political powers trying to impose their selfish interests over us.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. With nearly 2.3 million prisoners behind bars, the United States is the incarceration capital of the world. Our next guest is part of a new interfaith movement that is calling for an end to what they describe as a moral injustice and one of the dominant expressions of systemic racism in our country today. And we say hello to Billy Michael Honor, public scholar, faith leader, and civic organizer. He is the director of faith organizing for the New Georgia Project, which is a respected civic engagement organization founded by celebrated politician Stacey Abrams. He is also the organizing pastor of Pulse Church in downtown Atlanta. Pastor Billy Michael Honor, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here with you today.
Well, and we're really happy to have you with us. And, tough topic, mass incarceration. Remind us about the state of mass incarceration in the United States.
Yeah, well, we call the United States of America the land of the free and the home of the brave. But the land of the free has become the incarceration capital of the world. Right now, we incarcerate more people in the United States of America than any other country in the world, which is really interesting because, of course, we are only about 5% of the world's population, but we imprison about 25% of those who are in prison in the world. And on top of that, we have these policies about repressive regimes and evil empires that we oppose and we heavily sanction until they do right. But none of those none of those countries, whether it be China, Russia, or wherever, imprison people at the rate that we do. And all of that in a country where crime has continued to decrease, but yet we have continued to increase our prison population, which means that we have a problem in this country. And that's what our movement is trying to address.
It seems pretty backwards, to think of it in that terms too. When you mention those countries versus our country versus this mass incarceration, these numbers, and
right.
For some time now, you've been involved in organizing people of faith on the issue of mass incarceration. Why is this something faith leaders specifically should lean in on?
Well, first of all, it's because if you're a faith leader like I am, you believe that at the very core of the gospel that we proclaim and preach is the whole idea of liberation, the practice of liberation. Jesus in in Luke 4, talks about being moved by the Spirit in the sort of spirit of Isaiah the prophet to go out and to open up the prison to them that are bound and to speak a word to the brokenhearted. And to pronounce the year of Jubilee of the Lord's favor. All of these are very much social terms that have to do with social liberation of particular people who've been marginalized. And so I think at the core of our faith is a commitment to liberation, to those who find themselves to be disinherited, marginalized, or found on the edges of society. So I think, first of all, it's our call as Christians. It's a revolutionary piety that we have to have that causes us to loose the chains of oppression. And a spirituality of resistance, all of which I think are part and parcel of what it means to be a person of faith, moved by the conviction of the Spirit. So that's one. On the other hand, I would finally say the other reason it's important is because, quite frankly, how can we minister effectively and be taken seriously if we live in a country where we allow for this moral injustice to happen and we are not moved to become voices of moral courage to say, hey, look, there's a better way that we can practice restorative justice, right? And for many of us, this is what it's about. It's not to say that people don't commit crime or all those sorts of things. It's about reimagining the way in which we can restore people who have committed faults in better ways than simply imprisoning them in what oftentimes are poor and inhumane conditions.
You recently held a conference in Atlanta called Ending Mass Incarceration, and it's part of a multi-faith initiative. What is your plan to make people more effective in ending mass incarceration?
Yes, we did. We were very happy to have a conference. We had over 380 registrants, and on our opening night in plenaries with Michelle Alexander and Reverend Raphael Warnock, we had 1,500 people to attend those open sessions. And so it was all supposed to be a launch to a movement, right, to end the number of incarcerated persons in this country. And our strategy is, first of all, to resource faith communities. That's churches, mosques, temples, synagogues, etc., because this is a multi-faith movement. We live in the most multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious America ever. And so if you're going to have a movement like this, it has to be one that reaches broadly. And so that's why it's a multi-faith movement. And we want to resource faith communities with tools that they need to be able to end mass incarceration on their own level. So that has to do with doing expungements, which is record restriction. So we teach congregations how to bring people in who have criminal records that were nonviolent convictions or records that they weren't convicted at all. They just happen to have been arrested. And so it's on their record. We can get their records expunged. We can show them how to do it. We also teach congregations how to do bailouts, which is to raise awareness about cash bail. A lot of people who are in prison are jailed are people who haven't had a trial. They just are too poor to pay their cash bail, which means that we are criminalizing people just for being poor. And we feel like that's unjust. And so we're trying to teach people how to bail out those folks as a way of raising awareness about the corrupt cash bail system. We're trying to teach them how to put together legislation to end the funding of privatized prisons on state level. as well as banning preschool expulsion or reforming preschool expulsion, because we find out that really the pipeline from school to prison starts with preschool and all of the implicit bias that takes place around expulsion of particular types of individuals. And so these are the tools that we're teaching congregations, the things that they can do practically. And then on a broader level, finally, obviously, we want to organize on a regional basis around how we can push legislation that will stop really overwhelmingly the amount of folks who get incarcerated by pushing new measures, as I said, of restorative justice, other ways of dealing with people who find themselves in the judicial system.
It's pretty disturbing, when you're talking about where it all begins, and we're talking about preschool. We're talking about little kids. I mean, for so many people, that's where this begins. That's sobering.
Yeah, we had a presentation at the conference by Yale professor Walter Gillum, who's a child psychologist, and he's done a lot of research on this. And part of his research showed that on that level, what happens is, because when you're in preschool, there aren't many rules to how a preschool can dismiss a student. They can basically just say, hey, we don't think your child's a good fit. Whereas in K through 12, there are obviously many processes that have to go forth before you can do it. So implicit bias ends up being way more effective in preschool level, because the studies and the science shows that it doesn't matter if the teacher is white, black, Asian, or whatever. When they see a black boy or a big child, these are the primary biases that come up, and to assume that this child is the problem or is the source of whatever problems are happening in that preschool classroom. And so when that type of implicit bias happens, according to Walter Gillum, that starts a cycle that you see in terms of the preschool to prison pipeline.
And that poor kid only knows that they've been treated that way. So from the start of their time, that's what they know.
Exactly. They end up being targeted. And then once a child ends up being identified as a problem, there's a way in which the system carries that on from one level to the next. The child begins either consciously or unconsciously to begin to receive the message about themselves that they're a problem. And then here we go. There's a whole cycle that begins. And so there are actually some states that have already banned preschool expulsion. I'm sad to say I live in a state, Georgia, where it didn't pass, but we'll keep at it. And so we need a ban, period, across the board. It's not to say that there aren't some children who do have behavioral problems that need to be addressed or whatnot, but there should be processes put in place that make sure that the child is not just a victim of implicit bias. But right now, most states don't have that protection.
I agree. Just dropping them from the system, expulsion, is clearly not the way to go. We're speaking with Billy Honor, Director of Faith Organizing for the New Georgia Project, also the organizing pastor of Pulse Church in downtown Atlanta. And Billy, there's a role for politicians here. What are the political solutions to this issue?
Yeah, we were quite happy to have several politicians come to the conference and participate. I'll just give an example of some of the work being done. I mean, if you're a mayor on municipal level, I mean, one of the things you can do is you can close jails. Mayors have the ability to say or to push what will be included in budgets and what won't. So here in Atlanta, where I live, the mayor of Atlanta has courageously accepted an initiative and to close the juvenile detention center. And so closing jails is obviously one way to help reduce mass incarceration in this country. That can happen on municipal level. Mayors can also decide that they're not going to support cash bail. And so we've had mayors who have said that cash bail won't be practiced in our city. There's one elected official that often we forget because it's not as sexy, and that is district attorneys and judges. These are individuals who sometimes we get these ballots, and even some of the most more informed civic-minded persons get ballots, and you say, well, I don't know I don't know who these judges are. I don't know who the district attorney are. We just don't have the research on them. But we have to be more diligent to hold district attorneys and judges accountable, because they have a great deal of power as it relates to who gets incarcerated and how much time, right, people get incarcerated. And so I think if you're a district attorney, you can try to make sure that you give out fair sentences. You can question when there are police officers who repeatedly have their cases being challenged and are not given proper and adequate reports around certain issues of arrest. You can require that their superiors do better work before you accept any more reports. If you're a judge, if you're a district attorney, you can do your best to try to make sure that individuals are not receiving excessive sentences, and that there are other ways of trying to reform individuals who are in the system. All of those are things that elected officials can do.
Yeah, and especially two different people, one person of color, one person who's not. They do the exact same thing wrong by the law, and they get two different sentences. There's something wrong with that.
Happens all the time. And Michelle Alexander wrote about that beautifully in The New Jim Crow, where we talk about the war on drugs. If you try to chart mass incarceration and the rise of, there once was a time in this country, not long ago actually, where mass incarceration wasn't a thing. We've always had discrimination against people of color in the judicial system, but in terms of the alarming rate of incarceration, that's a 40-year sort of thing with the rise of privatized prisons, which were fueled by the war on drugs, right? And so the war on drugs basically introduced these mandatory minimums, sentences, excessive sentences, 3 strikes and you're outlaws, all of these types of things. And that pretty much, it caused the situation that we're in right now that you're referencing, where some people were being charged more for crack than for cocaine and et cetera, all those types of things. And so here we are.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also hope to change the way we think about mass incarceration, and this becomes particularly important during political campaign seasons when candidates like to appear as the law and order choice. How do you hope to reframe the issue in the public mind?
Well, that's a great question. Part of what I do in this work, primarily, I'm not an elected official. I'm not a lawyer or anything like that. As a faith leader, what I have to offer the most is narrative change. And so part of it is how it is we begin to reframe the issue in different ways, right? So one of the things that we want to do is, instead of talking about the criminal justice system, we call it the criminal injustice system, acknowledging that there have been things wrong with this system from the beginning, and that there is no sense of talking about correcting a system that's never been right. We need to think about full-scale change. Another way of reframing it is framing it in terms of restorative justice, that I've said a few times, talking about how the system can be about how it is we restore individuals who found themselves to have done wrong, recognizing that we need to be a country that gives people not just another chance or for six, in the way that our faith says that God has given us multiple chances. Reframing the conversation in terms of talking about how it is that we can help to love and care for those who have been forgotten by the system, right? Not criminalizing the poor. All of these are ways that we want to change the narrative around what's happening in terms of mass incarceration. And it begins with using the language of faith, because a lot of our faith traditions already have this language. We just need to employ it in different ways to help people to reframe and have more moral imagination about what's possible. I think it starts there.
And it's long, long overdue. Billy Honor, Director of Faith Organizing for the New Georgia Project, also the organizing pastor of Pulse Church in downtown Atlanta, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Billy, we certainly appreciate your time with us today. We'd love to have you back again soon.
Hey, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Love to come back anytime.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Can America end its love affair with guns? There's more progress than you may think. Bill Press talks with Igor Volsky, author of Guns Down: How to Defeat the NRA and Build a Safer Future with Fewer Guns.
Hello, Igor. Good to see you.
Bill, good to be here. Thank you for coming to my WeWork, by the way. For the first time you've come to me. I've always come to you over these years.
Well, now that you're the important head
That's right, yes.
Guns Down America. Right. So, Igor, let me ask you this. I've been a supporter of good, sensible gun safety legislation for probably over 30 years in the California legislature, on initiative campaigns in California, which I supported, here in Washington, D.C., and they've all failed, and things just seem to get worse and worse and worse. Is it just time to give up on gun safety?
No, absolutely.
Seriously?
No, I appreciate that. I think there is a sense, and not just on the gun issue, but, I think within political advocacy in general, and when you look at, the number of folks who distrust the government and distrust government institutions, there's this sense of, oh my God, there's so much money in the system. It's such hard work. Will it really pay off, right? Will things really change? And certainly on this issue, on the gun issue, when you have such huge tragedies like Newtown, right, and nothing really happens, I think it is frustrating, and as it should be, because it is. But I'll tell you, Bill, that, I started working on this issue in a real way at the end of 2015. And since then, between the end of 2015 and today, I've seen a remarkable amount of progress. And you have to remember, I'll just say one more thing, that there was no gun control movement really before Newtown. There really wasn't. I spent, as you know...
The Brady bill?
Well, okay, but that's the problem. You have to go all the way back to 93, 94, right? Mm-hmm. But between 94 and 2013, there was a real gap. In fact, I, as you know, started my career at Think Progress, and I didn't even have to think about the issue of guns. I was a reporter, a political reporter. I didn't have to think about the issue of guns until after Newtown, until after December of 2012.
Is that how you got started?
Well, that's how I became familiar with guns. But I remember thinking after that shooting, when it was clear that, maybe there'll be some movement on this issue, I thought to myself, literally, now I can learn a whole new issue. So this is all to say, it's a very young movement. And I'd argue that it's significantly stronger today than it was when I really started in it in December of 2015, and certainly than when we were in January of 2013 when the movement lost the background check bill expansion.
But you think about Newtown, okay, the parents of Sandy Hook who came to the Congress.
Yeah.
You think about the kids from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas School and who came here to Washington, D.C. and had that incredible rally. If they can't persuade this Congress to move, who can?
I think voters will persuade Congress to move by voting out the politicians who won't even have a debate on background checks, right? It passed the House. Now it's just stuck in the Senate. And frankly, Bill, and I've been saying this for a long time, most Democratic senators support expanding background checks. Yet after the House passed the background check expansion bill in February of this year, only 14 Democratic senators bothered to even say anything about it. And by that, I mean tweet about it. And we've been pushing, and I've been arguing, that senators who support this issue need to use their leverage as a senator to actually try to move this issue forward in the Senate, okay? You have Kamala Harris, you have Cory Booker, and you have Amy Klobuchar, all on the Senate Judiciary Committee, the Committee of Jurisdiction over gun issues, over background checks. It's where the Senate version of the House-passed bill is currently sitting with no action being taken. Why aren't all of those folks who are also running for president, why aren't they flipping tables and flipping chairs and demanding a hearing on this vote? Why aren't senators who support this issue filibustering and shutting down the Senate over this issue? Look, we can't wait for them to become president because people are dying today. They need to act today. We expect them to act today.
Is it because the NRA is still so powerful?
No, I don't think it's because of that. The NRA certainly has a great degree of sway, particularly within the Republican conference. But if there was ever a time to really lean in and to take on the NRA, it would be now, at a point where they are weaker than they've ever been. They're having tremendous leadership problems and challenges.
Internal disorder.
And you also have, Bill, prominent gun enthusiasts now saying publicly that they're going to stop supporting the NRA because of all of these leadership challenges, right? Because of all of these disclosures of crazy corruption within the NRA and within NRA leadership, and the fact that their board has apparently zero oversight over all the sweetheart deals that are going around for NRA leaders, for their spouses, for their family members. So this is really a time, I think, to make a move. But also, Bill, I argue that it's also a time to really redefine what patriotic gun ownership means in America. And it's up to really, to some degree, the gun owners of America to say, okay, we're no longer represented by these crooks who've benefited from our membership dollars. We're gonna redefine what responsible gun ownership means. And I argue that it's not just about keeping your gun safe at home and in a gun safe and having a trigger lock, that you have a responsibility to your community to organize like-minded gun owners to really bring about policy changes that will keep those communities safer, that will raise the standard of gun ownership so that everybody can prove that they're using their guns responsibly.
Okay, so let's back up a little bit and get the big picture. How serious a threat or crisis do you believe the gun problem is in America today? And then let's talk about some of the steps to resolve the problem.
Well, look, you have 40,000...
Is it worse than ever?
Yeah, it's worse than ever. It's at an all-time high. So the latest numbers are from 2017. We have 40,000 people who died from guns. 2/3 of those deaths are suicide. It's particularly bad in rural areas of this country, which is home to most of the firearm suicides. It's also particularly bad in some urban areas of this country where urban gun violence, everyday gun violence is a big problem. And of course, the people and communities that are disproportionately impacted are predominantly African American and Hispanic communities. And it has also become a problem nationwide, Bill, because you have families, mothers and fathers, afraid to send their children to school, afraid to send their children to some kind of public outing or a concert out of fear that something would happen, because we are a nation
or a place of worship,
all because we're a nation with more guns than people.
So, in some of the solutions, we've talked about background checks, right? That's a place to start?
That's a place to start, but it really... it should be a springboard to much bolder policies. And, let me just, I guess, back up and say that on this issue, Bill, and I started my career working on healthcare. And I can tell you that it's wonderful to see the folks who are running for president lay out big, bold goals of single-payer healthcare and Medicare for all. But I will attest to you, and if you ask anyone about this, they'll agree that we have no idea of how we can take a complex multi-payer healthcare system like we have here in America with, hundreds of millions of users and transform it into a single payer system. We don't know how to do it, right? People have ideas, we don't know how. On this issue, we know exactly what to do. We know exactly what works because other nations have significantly reduced their gun deaths, and so have states here. So what I talk about is 3 buckets of solution. The first one is really regulating the firearm industry to ensure that they're no longer producing military-style weapons for the civilian market. And by that, I don't just mean assault rifles. I also mean militarized handguns that are incredibly deadly and in some cases even deadlier than what you typically think of as an assault weapon. That's bucket 1. Bucket 2 is...
That would include multiple magazines.
Yeah, the high-capacity magazines. I think it also includes semi-automatic pistols that are using larger rounds, that are coming at you faster, that are killing you. You would have survived past generations of handguns. Now you're more likely to die if you're the victim of a shooting, particularly in an urban area.
Bucket 1.
Bucket
2.
Bucket 2 is making guns harder to get. I think you need to raise the standard of gun ownership. That means getting a license. That means registering your firearm. That means getting insurance. And bucket 3 deals with urban gun violence and looks at these very successful programs we've seen that are community-based and community-driven that work with the small number of individuals who are responsible for the overwhelming amount of violence in a particular community, and beginning to change their behavior and beginning to change community norms so they don't pick up a gun in the first place. Those programs have been incredibly successful in places like Boston and elsewhere, Oakland, and we need to really scale them. We need to really fund them.
A quick question on the that I should have asked earlier on the background checks. Are background checks today really worth it? I mean, aren't they kind of a joke? It's 24 hours.
Well, it could even be less than that. The typical background check only takes a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
Well, look, let me tell you what the science says, right? Because since you mentioned 93, right, when the Brady Bill became law and you had a federal floor for the first time for background checks, we now have new data, okay? And what this data tells us is that background checks at point of purchase, that is when you are in the gun shop and here's the gun I want, and you take it to the counter and you fill out a form and they run that fast background check, that while those checks are successful in preventing some individuals from obtaining firearms, they don't have population level impact. And what that means is you don't really see reductions on a population level across a period of time for gun homicides and gun suicides. And there are 2 theories as to why that's happening, why they're not really working in the way we want. One is the system that the FBI consults when they run a background check doesn't have enough records in it. Those records are sent in by a state. And while there have been measures, including under successful measures under George W. Bush, to try and provide greater incentives for states to send in records of prohibited persons, if you're convicted of a felony, for instance, who shouldn't have a gun, or other categories. But that hasn't been entirely successful. So there are gaps in the database. The other problem is what we've come to understand is what really reduces both gun suicides and gun homicides are 3 things. One is if you have to go to an actual police department to apply for a permit, you have to give your fingerprint, you have to have an interview with some kind of law enforcement officer. That officer can run a far more comprehensive background check than just the NICS system. That there's usually a waiting period between when you want a gun and when you can get one. All of those steps that occur in a licensing system in a place like Connecticut or a place like Massachusetts, that has the impact of keeping folks who want to do harm, who are trafficking guns, for instance, out of this process because they don't want to go to the police station, they don't want to get their fingerprinted. And also, just as importantly, the folks who use a gun to commit suicide usually do that when they're in a short period of personal crisis. Most people who get over that period of crisis don't go on to commit suicide again with a firearm. The percentage is like 90, it's very high. It's a very short period. And so if you have a system in place that lengthens the period of time between when you want a gun and when you can get a gun, that begins to save a lot of lives that we would have lost to suicide.
And is it a truism, and yet true, that the more guns out there, the more people are going to get killed by guns?
That's undoubtable, undeniable. That is fact. A study just came out a couple of days ago, Bill, that found that areas of the country that have a higher concentration of gun dealers have more gun deaths, specifically as it relates to domestic violence. So those altercations often turn deadly if there's the presence of a gun that you can easily purchase down
So you move around the country. When you meet someone who says, look, I'm not a big gun nut, but maybe I live in a rural area or whatever. I want to protect my family. I just feel that I can't count on the cops getting there in time. I want a gun to protect my family. What do you tell? I mean, these are legitimate people who have a legitimate interest. What do you tell them?
Well, here's what I say. The Second Amendment is not an entitlement. The Second Amendment is a right. And with rights come responsibilities. A well-regulated militia. It's in the body of the Second Amendment, but it's also, Bill, in the body of our entire Constitution. Where there's a right, there's a responsibility. You have a right to freedom of speech, but you have a responsibility not to yell fire in a crowded WeWork, right? You have a right to freedom of religion, but you have a responsibility to respect other people's religions. You have a right to a speedy trial, but you have a responsibility to serve in a jury. Where there's a right, there's a responsibility. And for many years, the NRA has sought to rewrite the Second Amendment, to transform it into an entitlement. Why? Because they're trying to help the gun industry sell more guns, and they're trying to increase their revenues and their membership dues in order to help Wayne LaPierre buy more expensive suits, right? That's the goal. And I actually think that it's the responsibility of gun owners who are responsible, the very people who you describe, to say, we must set a new standard for proving that we are responsible people who will use guns responsibly. Therefore, because I'm a responsible gun owner, I should have no problem getting a license, registering my firearm. Why? Because I know those reforms work in saving lives. In Massachusetts, the most robust licensing system in America, 97% of people in Massachusetts who apply for a license get that license. That means that most of the folks who choose to own a gun can jump through all of the hoops it requires to get one. And Massachusetts has incredibly low rates of homicide, and gun suicide.
Our guest today on the Bill Press Pod is Igor Volsky, who's the executive director of a new organization much worthy of your support, Guns Down America.
Bill Press talking with Igor Volsky, founder and the director of Guns Down America. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressShow.com. Well, that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Paul Starr, the Reverend Billy Honor, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.